Unfortunately, some people still think that way. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and we have a new episode lined up for you in which we are taking a look at a brand new movie, and that is Antoine Fuqua's Emancipation starring Will Smith. There has been considerable conversation about this film in recent weeks, about its treatment of history, about its treatment of slavery, the ongoing drama involving its star, Will Smith, and we'll be delving into much of that on this episode. One aspect of this film that really intrigues me is that it is by and large based on a single newspaper article from the July 4th, 1863 edition of what was most the widely read newspaper in America at that time, and that was Harper's Weekly. And it portrayed the story of an enslaved man who was described as Gordon, but has also been referred to in the historical record as Peter. And I believe in the film that is the name that he is referred to. This gets us into a whole other level of complexity on the historical record about were Gordon and Peter the same person, or were they actually two different people whose stories were merged together through poor record keeping and possible fabrication on the part of 1863 artists and journalists. We're going to be getting into all of that later on in the film. In the meantime, I am really interested to see how this movie will portray the evolution of the idea and the enactment of emancipation in the year 1863 in the wake of President Abraham Lincoln's presidential proclamation. So, much more to come. Without further ado, let's go ahead and start Emancipation. In these opening shots, we really get a sense of the scale of slavery, and indeed, in 1860 Louisiana, the enslaved population accounted for nearly half of the population in that state, about 47%. This was one of the richest states in the would-be Confederacy, and the port of New Orleans was no small part of that, being at the base of the Mississippi River, which would become the lifeblood of the Confederacy, and a major point of military confrontation over the forthcoming years. The historical record does suggest, as we see here in this scene within the enslaved family cabin, that Peter spoke French. And indeed, many enslaved persons within this part of Louisiana spoke French Creole and so on. And so capturing that is a good touch here at the outset.
Tell General Beale, should he impress any more on my property, I will take it up with Jefferson Davis himself.
The issue of impressment was something very notable within the hierarchy of Southern elites because, truth be told, the Confederacy, the Confederate military, started taking enslaved people for forced labor away from their owners long before the United States military started to. And so that undoubtedly is what this portion of the film is hinting at. The idea of putting people's decapitated heads on poles, it was certainly something that happened in earlier episodes pertaining to slave uprisings. In the aftermath of the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia is one prime example. I've never seen any accounts along those lines that actually took place during the Civil War. That's something I'd have to look into a little bit more so, but certainly in earlier moments, that sort of scare tactic, the means of intimidation, were used.
You stop when I say stop! You get out of here! Inside! All you! You move!
Wow, that's a great shot. Good cinematography there. A few takeaways from these camp scenes. I like the gritty look of it. It's filthy, it's unsanitary, it is a very volatile place to be living and working. We see passages from the Old Testament being read out loud, saying, "Slaves, be loyal to your earthly masters." We see a railway gun, which I think is a really great trait to include here on the railroad tracks in the background. It has the look, it has the proper ambience. There's some pretty good set dressing here. Some of the military uniforms, some are better than others. Oftentimes it's not a matter of what actors are wearing, but how they wear it. Is a big takeaway in regard to military uniforms in film. Oh, an R for runaway branded on his cheek. One of many horrors that could await such an individual who sought their freedom.
I heard it myself. Slaves are free. Free? Says who? Lincoln.
I think it's an interesting recreation showing how at this sort of organic grassroots level, enslaved men find out, they hear these rumors about emancipation, about movements of the United States Army, movements to places like Baton Rouge, located alongside the Mississippi River. What does it all mean? How are they going to formulate their escape? What does it mean in regard to the big picture? It's fascinating and uncertain and troubling and inspiring conversations that play out, because there are two facets to emancipation. There is the emancipation that is undertaken by the United States Army, and then there's the idea of self-emancipation that happens according to one's own will. And so I think these are really interesting points that are being depicted in the dialogue. So what we just saw here is a very action movie style escape, but this would seem to differ from the historical record in regard to the real man, Peter, who is said to have fled the plantation that he worked on that was about 50 miles to the west of Baton Rouge, and he did so alongside 2 or 3 other fellow enslaved men. It looks like we have the number right here as they're fleeing through the woods, but the circumstances of their escape and the scale of it is dramatically different in reality. As we're seeing this swamp chase unfold, I think one aspect that's kind of contrived is the character played by Ben Foster, whose name is Fassel, who's a fictional character. It doesn't make much sense that this overseer would be going after a single individual if there was a mass breakout from this Confederate Army labor camp site. If there were dozens of enslaved men who were running away, surely some of them were bound to be traveling in groups just by default. And so it makes very little sense in my mind that we have this sort of one-on-one showdown. It's very theatrical and very much a stretch in my thoughts.
Papa waptune. Pigaljon, sispal, quesa.
The real-life individual of Peter was said to be married, but there was no name given to his wife and there was no record of him having children. This is by and large a figment of the screenwriter's imagination to carry the narrative along, giving Peter additional reason to want to find freedom and later on to fight. So it makes sense, even if it's a bit ahistorical. We see Peter lathering mud on his face, it would seem. And according to some of the original documentation that talked about this man named Peter, he purportedly rubbed onions over himself to deter or throw off his scent from the dogs who may have been chasing him. There are other stories that slaves may have dipped their feet or their shoes in turpentine as well to likewise throw off the scent. So these were some of the commonalities, some of the tactics that were implemented.
My children and I look forward to serving Mr. Fabian.
Yeah, children ain't going.
Yes, sir.
Well, Mr. Fabian said he has you a new husband.
Instances of family members being sold off was a relatively common occurrence in this rather harsh plantation system, and it was also an important ripple effect, if you will, of the emancipation process, because when the war comes to an end, one of the primary motivations of the emancipated is to find their loved ones who had been sold off as chattel. So this is a very important process to understand in comprehending how slaves processed emancipation and what it meant after the war.
I'm a man!
I'm not sure where Confederates are getting all of these Henry repeating rifles in 1863. Those were very expensive high-tech weapons that were primarily obtained as private purchase weapons on the part of United States troops. Seeing them to the extent that I have in this film being used by white Southerners would have been a very rare thing. It's interesting that we see a large-scale cotton gin in the works here. The cotton gin, of course, was invented by a northerner, Eli Whitney, in 1793, and up until that point, slavery had been on the decline in the United States. But with the invention of this industrialized technology matched with widespread agrarian farming, slavery is revitalized. The likes of the cotton gin, tied in with other forms of technology and mass manufacturing, revitalizes slavery going into the 19th century. And it's the claims of many ill-informed Americans today that slavery was somehow dying out by the time of the American Civil War, and that couldn't be further from the truth. It was growing, it was expanding, it was worth more than all of the banks and commerce and railroads and everything else combined in America at that given moment. So that's something important to recognize as we consider the broader economic implications of slavery. That does not look like a Civil War era house. That's more of a Victorian looking house, perhaps constructed a few decades later.
Captain Andre Caillou, West Louisiana Native Guard.
You are with Lincoln.
Yes, we are. Get him in some water.
Yes, sir.
Andre Caillou was, in fact, a real-life personality, and he was part of a fairly substantial free African-American community who lived in the New Orleans area prior to the American Civil War. And he became one of the commanding officers of the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, which was also, in fact, one of the first African-American units to serve on behalf of the United States Army in the Civil War, even prior to the more famous 54th Massachusetts. This was a man whose courage was widely heralded. He was seen as an active citizen within the free black community in Louisiana. And spoiler alert, he also becomes one of the first African-American martyrs of the American Civil War as well. So it's nice to see the tip of a hat to a real-life hero. Here we see one of the great urban legends about the American Civil War being repeated here in cinema, and that is this notion that amputations happened on a widespread basis without any sort of anesthetic. In fact, over 95% of Civil War surgeries were done with anesthetic. The majority of patients were asleep as surgeries were ongoing. And scenes like this in some cases do a disservice to Civil War doctors because they were using the technology and the medicine to the best of their ability that they had available at the time. So it was really a revolutionary moment in regard to the evolution of medicine. Time and time again in a lot of these Civil War films, we have this stereotypical sawbones interpretation of Civil War surgery. The material culture, the uniforms depicting United States soldiers is much better in this film than what we see depicted of the Confederate soldiers.
Train cars carrying big guns?
Yes. I build their tracks. Am I not free?
Just keep yourself steady. Technically, while you're here, you're contraband.
We're introduced to an important phrase here in the historical context of the film, and that is contraband. And on this point, there is a fantastic book by James Oakes, which is called Freedom National. And it does an excellent job at showing the step-by-step process as to how emancipation was realized and implemented. And one of the major characters that we have in this regard is a United States general by the name of Benjamin Butler, who was not a very efficient battlefield tacticianer, but he was a very astute political thinker, and he understood a lot of these political and economic forces of the war far ahead of some of his fellow colleagues. And on this point about this massive influx of formerly enslaved people entering the United States lines, Oakes says this: Benjamin Butler also faced an urgent practical problem. It is a physical impossibility to take all, said the general. There were upwards of 100,000 slaves in the areas occupied by Union forces in Louisiana in 1862, and perhaps more than 150,000 Union-occupied parts of the lower Mississippi Valley. The Army could not employ that many workers, nor could its commissary readily supply the provisions to feed and shelter them. For Butler, it was not a question of the right or wrong of slavery. Reared in the full belief that slavery is a curse upon the nation, he explained, further acquaintance with it only deepens and widens that conviction. But whereas Butler could accommodate a few thousand free people in Virginia, he felt overwhelmed by the numbers in Louisiana. Now, Butler asked Secretary of War Stanton on May 25th, "What am I to do?" And so this leads to a very interesting logistical question that the United States forces have to think about. How are they going to make use of these freed people? How are they going to take care of them? Can they take care of them? And one option that they have ultimately is the enlistment of African American men into the armed forces. We are going to see a strengthening of the various confiscation acts of so-called contraband, whereas slaves who were considered property by their owners will now be accepted or confiscated as such on the part of the United States Army. In these sorts of situations, as Peter finds out in this scene, these individuals were often in limbo as a result. And it was a borderland. It was somewhere in between in regard to slavery and freedom, but it was a stepping stone nonetheless.
Gordon, please. Gordon. Good to see you, my friend. Good to see you. How are you? We made it. Yes, we have. John? No, he did not make it. I will come see you. Thank you.
And so we're reintroduced to Gordon here. And in the historical memory of all of this, Gordon and Peter have often been meshed together as the same person. I think the film gets it right here in indicating that they were in fact two different individuals. And we'll revisit why I think that in a little bit.
Makes a likeness of you. Peter, we're gonna make sure that every person in the world knows exactly what slavery truly looks like.
So the Civil War, of course, is one of the first armed conflicts that is widely photographed. And the two photographers that we see here were real individuals. They went by the names McPherson and Oliver. We don't know too much about them. You can find some of their photographs in the online collections of the Library of Congress. And this photograph that they took of Peter is very, very different from everything else in their catalog. Most of their photographs were of landscapes, the landscapes of war, fortifications, railroad lines. In fact, there aren't really any other photographs of people. And so this one is distinctly unique, if they did in fact take that photo in the first place, which is also up to conjecture. And this photograph, I'm sure as we'll find out later on, perhaps near the end of the film, it galvanizes the North. It raises awareness about the cruelties of slavery. And it went to show how photography could be used for political purposes in a really profound way.
Is this the Negro here that was running from Clinton?
Yes, sir.
What were you doing there?
We built the railroad.
What did you see?
It's okay. Cannons.
Cannons. Like them.
No, not like those. Big cannons.
The conversation that we see here between Peter and this brigadier general is an important one in understanding how the United States Army often gathers its intelligence during the American Civil War. Freedom-seeking enslaved individuals, not only do they serve a purpose in filling the ranks of the Army, but they also provide information to officers and generals who are often desperate for it. That is something tactically significant for us to think about.
How the hell did you survive all those days in the swamp?
I know this one.
It said that Peter's journey across the swamp to Baton Rouge took about 10 days, which is quite a feat in and of itself. And purportedly, the famous photograph that is taken, that image was struck on April 2nd, 1863. And so, as all of that is happening, that moment, that spring, early 1863, it was really a low point for many portions of the United States Army. The previous December, the Army of the Potomac had been defeated at Fredericksburg. It was soon to be defeated again at the Battle of Chancellorsville. There was this hard slog through the swamps of Mississippi as Ulysses Grant was attempting to capture Vicksburg. And part of the Vicksburg campaign was a location that was just mentioned in the film, and that is Port Hudson. Port Hudson would evolve into a siege that would actually last longer than the siege of Vicksburg itself. Fighting would go on there for 48 days. And as I get a sense we're going to find out here shortly, United States colored troops, as they were formerly known at the time, are going to play a major role in that engagement.
Not to prove something to some general. Freedom! Freedom for you. Freedom for the man next to you. Freedom for the people back in the fields. We will not ask for freedom. We will not wait for freedom to be handed to us. We will take freedom.
That was a well-acted scene.
Left, right, left, right.
The line of corpses here along the road is a good representation of the aftermath of Civil War battles, something itself which was captured through the camera's lens on numerous occasions throughout the various battlefields. So we see the troops marching here at support arms, although they would have been marching a little bit faster than that. But somebody did a little bit of homework here at least. Unlikely they would have spread out, unless I'm missing something here. The Civil War soldiers, fighting formations, you march and fight shoulder to shoulder, you amass your fire, that is how you strike at your enemy. So, well. Some great cinematography and good special effects here. And indeed, Captain Caillou did die a hero's death at Port Hudson, and he was honored all throughout the North in the weeks following his death. I think the battle scene that we just saw had some strengths. I think it captured the violence, the intensity, the scale. How it plays out tactically, though, it could have been a little bit stronger. But there's one thing certain, and that's this ain't glory. I'll certainly give credit here where credit is due, though, in regard to good little period details. And if we even look at Will Smith's kepi, the cap that he's wearing, there's like a red Maltese cross, and that is the emblem of the United States Army's 19th Corps. And this was commanded by Nathaniel Banks, who was the U.S. commander at the Battle of Port Hudson. Several thousand men under his command, and within the 19th Corps, there were 2 brigades of black troops, comprised of 9 different regiments, including the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, and that's the number 1 that we see on his kepi. So there are some hints of good material culture and unit military details.
Captain Lyons, may God above show no mercy upon your pitiful soul.
We just saw a plantation owner be assassinated. That didn't, to my knowledge, happen with great regularity, but it's certainly in the realm of possibility.
You're free. You ain't got to do this no more. Listening to this man, we's free. Free.
The interaction that we see here has by and large been left out of so many Civil War movies of the past 85 years that even on the rare occasion when emancipation is shown cinematically, it's often done so through white protagonists who are deliverers. And certainly that was the case in many instances. But this and Glory are really two of the only examples where we see African Americans actively contributing to emancipation as well, which is an important thing to recognize both historically and cinematically. There we go. And that's what emancipation is all about. The root of a lot of this uncertainty stems to a July 4th, 1863 article and illustration spread in Harper's Weekly. The centerpiece of that spread is a man, supposedly by the name of Peter, who is showing his whipped back. Bookending him is 2 other illustrations, which in essence claim to be the same person. All 3 of them in the caption claim to be Gordon. But there's been a lot of really good scholarship done on this in more recent years. And the reality of it is likely that the stories of Gordon and Peter, both of whom show up in this film, were conflated and mixed together, quite possibly by even abolitionists who were less interested perhaps in the personal story, and they were more so interested in using the imagery to serve the anti-slavery purpose. Ultimately, I think the beginning and end of this film were the strongest parts of it. In the beginning, our character is thrown into this grimy, horrible mix within the Confederate military labor structure. I think the end excels in showing how formerly enslaved individuals were empowered by putting on the uniform of the United States Army. That is likewise balanced out by some fairly gripping combat scenes in the latter stages of the film. I think it is in the middle where the film lags the most during the whole chase sequence through the swamps. Although it had a few exciting, thrilling, suspenseful moments, it lacked the sort of captivation that I think bookended it ultimately. One of the inherent problems with this film is that it is based on a story upon which we have very little information to begin with. Much of this film's premise is taken from that July 1863 Harper's Weekly article, which, all things considered, has very little information or corroborating evidence. And by and large, the rest of this script is left up to the imagination of the screenwriter. We are not entirely certain what happened to Peter. We aren't entirely certain if he survived the war. We don't know if he reunited with his family. We don't know if he had children. We don't know his last name. if he gave himself a new name when the war came to an end. There are just so many uncertainties associated with his story that it leaves the potential for a whole lot of historical problems and plot holes when we think about how he is represented in cinema. I think one of the bigger questions to ask from Emancipation is why the screenwriter and the director didn't choose from a slew of other, far more substantiated and equally compelling stories associated with the United States colored troops. I myself would love to see a sequel to the movie Glory, because that film ends giving you the impression that this was a regiment that was annihilated and that was the end of their service, which was far from the historical reality. But on top of that, there are so many other compelling stories of other regiments, and there are so many great records behind all of them. The photograph tells a story, undoubtedly. As the saying goes, a picture says 1,000 words. And for people in the 1860s, that photograph spoke of a reality. But as we try to connect the dots, the truth of the matter is that we don't know the full, complete story behind the photograph. It leads to another question as well. Does that lack of information give or grant the screenwriter flexibility to simply make up a story? Or is he granted artistic license accordingly by not having historical information readily at his disposal? These are the sorts of quibbles and dilemmas that we find, historically speaking, in films like this. To conclude, I would say to a large extent this film is a missed opportunity. We're given very little backstory on the whipping itself that created these horrible scars on Peter's back. We lose the dynamic of what caused that in the first place on the enslaved labor farm that he resided on. We really don't get a sense of the relationship between he and his overseer, a man by the name of Carrier, who inflicted this upon him, how his master reacted to it, and what possible role all of that had in him fleeing away in the first place. We don't get a sense of any of that, and to an extent it's kind of trivialized as a result. I think in some ways this film was a noble effort, but in other ways it was also a missed opportunity. Something that I am certain of, however, though, is the fact that there's a lot of really great scholarship and good books on this topic if you are looking for more. Two of which I mentioned already. We have The Slaves' War by Andrew Ward, which is a really great compilation of first-hand accounts of enslaved and emancipated people in their own words. We also have Freedom National by James Oakes, which looks at emancipation both in political circles and the ground level. How was emancipation finally realized? And then finally, we have Chandra Manning's book, Troubled Refuge, and the subtitle for that is Struggling for Freedom in the Civil War. And this book excels in demonstrating that sort of limbo that I mentioned earlier, what awaits formerly enslaved people between the plantation and once they reach the United States Army. It was sometimes a very complicated and convoluted process. It was also a desperate struggle for survival in many cases in and of itself. So this is a good book in considering that realm of discussion as well. I very much hope that you enjoyed this episode of Real History for this first-time reaction with me regarding the movie Emancipation. It was not a complete disappointment, but ultimately I felt that it could have been a lot more as well. I want to hear your thoughts on the film. Feel free to share your views in the comments section below, and also feel free to discuss what sort of Civil War topic you would like to see turned into a movie, and what other Civil War movies should we examine here on our channel. As always, we look forward to hearing from you, and until next time, stay curious.